you. It's a really big influence for me, and a beautiful trout lily that was growing in our woods. So I have a little farm in Ashtabula County, which is the most northeastern county in all of Ohio. We
Hey,
live
John.
about, yes,
I don't know. I can't see your PowerPoint right now. I apologize.
really?
Yeah, let's make sure you're sharing screen.
Okay.
All right.
Where's the share screen?
If you go into the Zoom, window, it should be at the bottom.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Of course.
There we go.
Okay, can we see it now?
Yes, we're good to go. Awesome.
Okay, sorry about that, y'all. Yeah, so here is the Yule Gibbons quote that I was promising you all before. Basically, he's a big inspiration for me, and because like the way I look at it, humans sort of evolved out of the ecosystems where they were. So nature is sort of like our mother. Beautiful trout lily that was in our woods behind our house here in Ashtabula County. So I have a little farm in Ashtabula County, Ohio. It's the most northeastern county in Ohio. We're about 10 miles from Lake Erie and about 10 miles from Pennsylvania. We have our weather is moderated by the lake, and our soils are sort of moderated by the glaciers that came through so many thousands of years ago. So we sort of live in a wetland. We're trying to make the best out of it. And we're focused mainly on agriculture, horticulture, agriculture. We have a nursery here, and we do a lot of classes and work around teaching folks how to grow food in a holistic way. And my wife also does a lot with natural building. So we have a lot of stuff going on here at the farm. All right, so degradation of our ecosystems has been an ongoing thing for the last several hundred years. Whether it's just folks cutting trees down and forests down for progress, for firewood, for building materials, for charcoal, that sort of march toward that manifest destiny has brought us to soils that are in really poor shape. So this study here sort of exemplifies that. This was done by the USDA. It's one of the longest long-term type of studies of this type. And basically what it comes down to is that we've lost a huge amount of the trace minerals, especially, and essential minerals that our bodies need to for things to work correctly. We've lost that. So essentially the amount of copper that's in, say, a carrot, we have to eat 3 times as many carrots as people before 1940 did to get the same amount of copper. And since these trace minerals act as cofactors for enzymes, so inside of our body we have enzymes that are breaking down our food and making things work, and all the processes that are happening inside of there work with enzymes. And at the center of those enzymes are trace minerals. And when we lose those trace minerals, our bodies lose the functions that they once had. So agriculture is tied to this, but also just sort of like land degradation in general. The ratios of these minerals has gone way out of whack. So we're left with food that is nutritionally deficient. We're missing a lot. We don't even know what we're missing because many of us were just born into it, like I was. I was born in the early 80s. So one of the ways that we can sort of like sidestep that or get around it is by partnering with the natural world. And that's where the wild edibles come into play. And the great thing about them is all these connections that they have with everybody else. So I had those 2 slides that were sort of a bummer. And I talked a little bit about that, but the rest of this is going to be plants and just like heavy plant nerding out. So yeah, thanks for sitting through those first 2 slides. Yeah. So some things to think about when you're out in the world and you're foraging for wild foods. Some of these wild foods, not most of the ones that I'm talking about today, but there are some wild foods that may be abundant in some areas and maybe not so abundant where you are, or vice versa. You might have a lot of them and other people might have less of them. So you need to be able to read the room. And, if there's a lot of plants in an area, then you can think about harvesting some in a way that is sustainable. And we're going to talk about that with specific plants as we go through those profiles. So that's a big part of it. If there's only a few plants and you where those plants might get destroyed or you're not going to be back to those areas, I try to use horticultural techniques to take the seed or take a small piece of the root where this is possible. It's not possible everywhere that you go. Of course, you can't just do that when you're on friends' land or people you can do that. You can take a small amount of the root of a plant and you can propagate it and grow it. Many of these wild edibles are perennial plants. So when you get a small piece of the root, they can very easily grow into a new plant. So we're going to talk about those horticultural aspects of the plants as we go through as well. So second piece, you want to learn proper identification of the plants. I'm going to be giving you some key identification characteristics of each plant as we go through today. So that should help you with that, but I'm going to give you some references at the end of this talk as well so that you can go on your own and hopefully have feel safe about that. I'm trying not to I don't want to take any responsibility for people poisoning themselves. I want you to make sure that you're identifying those plants properly before you're trying to eat them. So number 3, where you harvest matters. Obviously, if you're harvesting in a park or someplace where people are walking, remember there's a height where dogs like to pee, right? Up to your knee and below. And it's certain next to the path or the road. These are our prime dog pee spots. So I try to avoid those. And generally where there's road and there's road salt, we have a lot of salts and other things put on our roads, even fracking chemicals, unfortunately, even on our roads here in Ashtabula County. So we want to be careful where we're harvesting in that respect. So that 4th piece, learn to propagate the rare wild plants where you find them. This is the piece that's missing from a lot of wild edibles, is that cultivation piece. Native peoples were cultivating these plants, and we need to jump in and start cultivating them as well. So if you keep hearing about these plants that some of them are highly fetishized, like there's a fetish around them, like morels and ginseng and ramps, there's a little bit of a fetish there. So sometimes people can get overzealous and over harvest. So it makes sense for us to get a few plants where we can, and you can even buy things like ramps and ginseng as little root pieces, and we can start to cultivate those plants. And then when we dig up our ginseng after it's been in the ground for 10 or 15 years, we can take a little piece of that root and stick it back in the ground and not necessarily have to start them from seed again. So Joe Hollis down at Mountain Gardens outside of in North Carolina has done a lot of really good work in that space. So getting right to it, some wild shoots. These are plants that we're going to be eating the green parts that are the fresh, new green parts coming up. That's almost always the case. We're usually not eating the older leaves that have been on the plant since it first came out of the ground. Usually we're eating the fresh, new leaves that are just growing. This is where the cells are expanding the fastest. This is where the tissue is the softest. So that's where we want to be. All right. So the first one. By the way, most of these plants today are plants that grow in my woods, and that's why I picked them, because these are plants that are sort of close to my heart. They live in my backyard. They're sort of this. They have the terroir of the land, like I'm trying to have myself. So, the false Solomon seal grows as an understory plant in the forest. So it's very shade tolerant. It even grows under shade tolerant trees and shrubs like witch hazel and spice bush and pawpaws and things like that. So beautiful flowers at the end of the stalk there. The part that you want to eat of this plant are the new shoots that are coming up in the spring before they unfurl. It'll just be like asparagus. If any of you have ever seen asparagus when it's fully growing in the middle of the season, like in July, there are these fronds, these ferny fronds that are sticking out everywhere, and it's as tall as a person. So that's not the asparagus that we buy in the store, right? So these full-size pictures of the false Solomon seal is the same kind of way. We're eating it when it's just a shoot coming out of the ground, and unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of it. I need to take some pictures myself. So that's when we want to be eating it, and we want to eat it cooked. There's a lot of plants, wild plants, especially, that have to make sort of secondary chemicals within themselves to protect themselves from herbivores that want to eat them, like deer and rabbits and everything else. Everything wants to eat these plants, so they have to produce things inside of them to protect themselves from that. In the case of the false Solomon seal, it's it's oxalic acid. So there's these little calcium oxalate crystals that are in the false Solomon seal that can be, most people, you could eat them raw, but if you had any kind of kidney thing going on at all, those little crystals can mess with your kidneys. So it's usually recommended to cook those first. It's much better for you in general. It's going to get rid of all that oxalate. So these beautiful white blooms that are at the ends, the tips of the plant, they're not, there's another plant called false Solomon seal that has little bell-shaped flowers that grow all along the underside of the stem that looks very similar in its leaves to the false Solomon seal. Yeah, this is the false Solomon seal. Excuse me, I meant the Solomon seal. This is Polygonatum, not Mainanthemum. That one has flowers underneath, and the false Solomon seal has this flowers coming out at the tips. Also, the way that the leaves attach to the stem are different from the Solomon seal, in that they have a tiny little stem that attaches them to the main stem. The leaves have a tiny little stem called a petiole that attaches them to the main stalk. They also have these red berries that come after those white flowers that are at the tips, the very ends of the stalk, right? So this plant has a lot of different insects that really like to feed on those flowers. It's really important for many types of beetles and longhorn beetles and blister beetles and beetles that live in the forest, many of which spend some of their lifetime as larvae in rotting wood. So the rotting wood in the forest, it's an important piece as well for all of the life cycle of a lot of these forest insects. So those red berries obviously are drawing in birds. So the ruffed grouse and the veery, those are just a couple of the birds that are brought in by this particular plant. And of course, mice and deer sort of moving them around. So those berries, that red and those colors, we've evolved to see them really well. That's why McDonald's uses the red and the yellow, but many types of animals are also adapted to those colors because they know that there's the good stuff good nutrients and fats and all the stuff that they need is in there. So that's the false Solomon seal. So look for that in the forest next time you're out. All right, next one. We're going to kind of cruise through these. I only have an hour, so I have a lot of plants to go through. So I'm going to kind of go through them quickly. I'm going to try to be as thorough as possible, and hopefully we get enough time for some questions at the end. So this is the ostrich fern. This is a very popular wild edible. It's actually canned and sold in the Northeast, in some places called fiddleheads. There's an industry. It's not as big as it used to be, but there's an industry still that's canning these plants. And the same with the pokeweed is another wild edible plant that used to have a canning industry that was associated with it. So yeah, this is a fern that lives in the forest. These ferns don't reproduce by seeds, but they have spores. So they're sort of like in the evolutionary tree of plants, they're still fairly primordial in that respect. But these ones are really a delicacy. You see them at high-end restaurants. You see them for very high prices at like Whole Foods and places like that. It's just sort of a very high-end vegetable, which a lot of wild edibles tend to be when they tend to be niche things, even if this is growing in profusion behind your house. These love to grow in the shade, the ostrich fern. They don't necessarily have to be in the shade of a forest. They can be on just the shady side of your house and they'll make a colony. You can see in this the picture on the left how there's many plants there. That probably started from 2 or 3 plants. So they are colony formers. They'll have lots of plants before you know it. Some key ID characteristics, that papery scale. You see the top left picture, that papery scale that is on the shoots prior to them coming out of the ground. They sort of break through that papery scale. That's a key identification characteristic. There's a deep U-shaped groove on the stem. The stem is also smooth, has no hairs on it. So that groove is a key identification characteristic as well. When they first come out of the paper like that and they're still curled up and small, that's the perfect time to be harvesting those shoots. And I didn't mention this before, but they need to be cooked. It's very important, just like the false Solomon seal, that the ostrich fern is cooked. These are not good to eat raw. I'm not exactly sure what they have in them, but all of the reference materials that I found on them said they need to be cooked. So there are specific aphids and there are specific moths that are just feeding on the ostrich fern. So there's a lot of insects that are like this. When you get, especially these colony forming plants that can grow in profusion in the understory, they will often have insects that are specific to them. Just because there's so many of those plants that the insects over time will evolve in that way. Also having this green cover in your forest, you know, the ferns get up and they start growing very early in the spring. So these are available, you know, by the end of April, they're all over the place, at least around here where I am in Northeast Ohio. So they sort of get up and out before a lot of the trees have their leaves fully on. So that's sort of what the niche that a lot of these understory forest plants occupy. They're getting that sunlight and going through large parts of their life cycle really early in the year. Really good to have in your forest as an understory plant, just to stop the erosion of those soils by having these layers within your forest. A lot of times our forests are so degraded that we're missing some of those layers, whether it's from having too many deer or from having too close of clear cutting events to one another. There's a lot of different reasons, but yeah, these understory herbaceous plants are really important. So here's another sort of sexy one that you hear talked about a lot, and these are ramps. This is a wild onion or wild garlic. It's and it has that garlic onion type of flavor. So this is another one that you can very easily find over harvested because there's a market for it. There's a lot of, it's used by high-end chefs. People are buying it in high-end grocery stores. And in some places it's very, very common. In some places it's not very common at all. It likes to grow in our woods in certain places that are up out of the water. This is another piece of this, that it really doesn't want to be sitting in water. But these colony forming plants, like the ramps and like the ostrich fern and even the false Solomon seal, because they form large colonies, it's one plant that has rhizomes that are creeping and sprouting up in different places around the central mother plant. We can dig those up and we can move them around. So that makes it, propagation becomes a lot easier with these perennial plants. If anyone's ever dug up your hostas or divided hostas, it's sort of the same idea. You can divide these clumps, separate individual plants out if you want to, and then set them all out at even spacings and set out a huge colony for yourself in your woods. So with the ramps, because they grow back, what a lot of folks are doing as a sustainable harvest is not really digging them up at all, but is cutting them off at the surface. So the last two plants that we talked about are sort of cut off at the surface. Sometimes folks dig up ramps and sell the whole thing with the bulb as well, like this picture on the left. So for a really sustainable harvest, we don't want to do that unless we have a lot of plants, unless your forest is carpeted with ramps, in which case, dig away, do your thing. I'm not saying dig up all the ramps, but I'm saying you should be feel free. You should be freely allowed to dig up some ramps if you want to. But if there's only a small amount of those ramps, you might want to think about that. You might want to actually dig them up and move them around to plant more of them. So we're not trying to deplete plants in an area wherever they're at, even if the prices are high and you could sell it to a fancy restaurant or whatever you can do with it. So some key identification characteristics of the ramps. It's this sort of red sheath that's at the bottom of the leaf blades. You have two leaves that come out, and you have this sort of onion smell. These large colonies in the forest, that's another key identification characteristic. I put this lily of the valley warning up there just so you do know that there are other plants that look like ramps, but when you sniff the lily of the valley, if you crush some of those leaves and you smell it, it does not smell like ramps. It doesn't smell like onions. It doesn't give that garlicky onion smell, which most of us know. Also, the way that the convallaria comes up is different from the way that the ramps do. So the ramps come up with these two little leaves split apart, and the convallaria has a whorl of leaves. So the smell is going to be the kicker. That red sheath at the base and the way that the leaves come up off the plant are going to give it away. So many types of bees are attracted to the flowers of the ramps. The ramps flower in sort of late spring, early summer to midsummer. And the leaves actually die back and they just have a flower stalk that's left. And oftentimes you'll find the seeds on the ends of the stalk in like August, September, starting to ripen up. So those flowers, they're not really photosynthesizing. The leaves are already gone. So they're just there for these pollinating insects. So there's many types of forest bees that have sort of adapted to that. All right, so I got through all the shoots. These are the runner-ups, the ones that I really wanted to talk about, but I only have an hour, so I couldn't talk about everybody. So we'll start with the top left there. That's the evening primrose. That's a native plant that most people think is a weed that they should be trying to eradicate, but it's actually a native plant. It blooms at night, brings a lot of moths, and also consequently a lot of bats. So Evening primrose, great plant. You can eat the flowers, the leaves, the roots. Had a brief stint as being bred in the Soviet Union when they were trying to get to be totally self-sufficient in all their own food. So evening primrose is a cool plant. It's a biennial. A lot of the rest of these are perennials. So this one, it will bloom after 2 years. It goes through 1 year of vegetative growth and then another winter, and then it blooms the next summer. So top left there, evening primrose. The top middle, that's the greenbrier or the catbrier. That's a smilax is the genus for those ones. Forest edge species, evergreen, semi-evergreen. They vine, but they actually have tendrils. They don't really vine. They grab on with tendrils like grapes do. And the part that you eat from the greenbrier, the catbrier, are the shoots, the tips, the very tips of the new shoots that are being formed when they're soft and succulent. And I think they taste like a slightly green tomato. Really nice. Those ones are cooked, and so are the evening primrose. I eat those cooked as well. So all the way on the top right, that is the Solomon seal. So the very first plant we talked about was the false Solomon seal. This is the true Solomon seal. This is Polygonatum is the genus for this one. And this one, you eat the new shoots in the same way that you do the false Solomon seal, but you can actually see how the flowers are born underneath the stalk of the plant. So yeah, this one is a great medicinal plant. We make salves out of it for like achy bones and arthritic muscles. But we also eat the shoots when they come up in the spring. They sort of have the taste of peas. They're really nice, really, really nice. And they bring in a lot of bees to those little white flowers. Yeah, that's another one that you can dig up, break off a piece of the root, replant it really easily. The smilax, we do a little bit of growing from tips. So they're very sprawling and viney. We'll actually take a tip and stick it into the soil. And then when it starts to grow from that tip, we will cut it away and put it in a different location. So we propagate that plant that way. So the bottom left corner, that is the Canada honewort. The honewort is in a genus called Cryptotania, and this is in the same genus as a Japanese vegetable called mitsuba. So that's what I sort of got interested in this originally. Honewort is edible as well. It's in the ethnobotanical literature as such. And it has sort of a parsley flavor. And it does taste like the mitsuba, which I also grow, which is the Japanese vegetable. But it's not as productive. This is sort of a smaller plant, like semi-shade, brings in beneficial insects. It's in the carrot family. One of my favorites. And then that bottom middle plant, that is the cutleaf toothwort. This is a plant that grows all through our woods. It's in the cabbage family. Before those flowers fully open up, it's like a tiny little broccoli. We eat the little broccolis. We dig up the root. It's peppery and spicy. We use it like a horseradish. So yeah, and that one grows in the shade, in the understory, all over our woods. So yeah, these are the runners up. I wish I could have talked about all of them, but I can't. So I got to keep moving. Roots. These are the things that feed us. They give us carbohydrates, and they're the potatoes of that meat and potatoes part of like sustenance. So the first one, this is the yellow trout lily, grows all over our woods. The part that you eat is the rhizome, which is actually can be a few inches below the ground. So the only trout lilies that we dig up are ones that are flowering, or they at least have to have 2 sets of leaves. But mostly we look for the flowering ones. They have the largest roots. And it's about the size of a couple kernels of corn, maybe my thumbnail. Really tasty, tastes like corn as well. And they're born pretty profusely. They're all over our forest. One good way to identify them is by the lower leaf surface is solid green. You can see that bottom right corner, that picture If you flip that leaf over, it's totally green. If you look at it from above, it's mottled. Like the first picture we saw of the whole thing, that was actually a nicer picture, but this one in the top right, you can sort of see how the leaves are mottled. And that's part of what helps disguise them from deer, because the deer are colorblind, right? So that mottling is sort of like a camouflage. But that's a good way to identify these plants, those yellow flowers as well. Yes, lots of different types of bees. There is a bee that is specific to the trout lily. This trout lily minor bee, it only goes to the trout lily. It's evolved with the trout lily. This kind of mutualism is common when you get to these plants that grow in these big colonies. Like I said, there's a lot of, when there's a large colony of plants, and there's a lot of food and fodder there, the insects will evolve with it to figure out a way to access it. So another interesting thing about the seeds of the trout lily is that they have these little fatty nodules on them called elaiosomes, which are there to attract ants, woodland ants, to move the seeds around. So the ants will move the seeds because they're attached to these fatty structures. They'll eat the fatty structures off of there, and then they actually bury the seeds. They also do this with, I've seen it in borage seeds. I've seen them do this with borage seeds. I've seen them do this with castor oil seeds as well. Not native plants at all, but different plants that have these same little fatty structures that are built specifically for ants to move around. All right, so we're getting into the nitty gritty now. So this is a plant that some people, that when they don't know it well, their eyes start to roll all the way back into their head when I start to talk about it. But I want you to hear me out. So the Jerusalem artichoke is a very prolific plant in most places where it grows throughout the Midwest and the Northeast of the United States, even through the South and the West. It's growing all over the place. It really loves to be in the Midwest. It originated in the Ohio Valley, down near Cincinnati and those places. So it's really a cosmopolitan plant that's very, very productive. It's been taken over to Europe, and there's been a lot of breeding done there. But it produces these roots that have carbohydrates in them. But instead of those sugars or carbohydrates being in the form of like fructose, like fruits are, or many types, not all fruits, but you know what I mean, those different types of sugars. The sugars in the sunchoke are in this form called inulin. And inulin has this, this way of making people a little bit gassy when they're not used to eating it. And this can be actually really good for diabetics, where like someone like my father who's diabetic can't really eat potatoes or rice because they spike the blood sugar. The sugars that are in the sunchoke don't do that. They don't spike your blood sugar. They make you fart because they actually are feeding bacteria that live in your lower intestine. They've done a lot of studies with this plant, and that they found that those bacteria that are living in your large intestine that are making all the farts, they're actually producing butyrate. And butyrate is something that your body, when you get enough of it, the microbes that live in your gut turn on, and you start absorbing calcium a lot better. Your immune system is modulated. There's a lot of things that start to happen when you get enough butyrate and inulin in your body, these non-digestible fiber. This also consequently was a sort of a staple crop. Maybe not a staple crop, but it was a secondary crop for many native peoples throughout the eastern United States. So people were always eating it. It was because it was very productive. Yeah. So they also took this plant over to Europe, and they started making an alcohol out of it. In Europe, they called it Toppen Amber, which is a weird name, but it was sort of an exotic name given to it to make European people think it was more exotic than it actually was. So you can buy Toppen Amber syrup from like Germany and France, and this is sweet syrup like sorghum molasses or maple syrup that's made from the roots of the Jerusalem artichoke. They also make a liquor, which I've bought and tried before as well. I don't really like liquor, so I didn't like it, but it was definitely it was high proof and did the trick. So a very important crop as far as potential. I mean, there was at the end of the 1970s, when there was still an oil crisis, from the earlier 1973 oil crisis, there was a lot of people looking for American like crops that would grow wild that they could turn into ethanol fuels so that we could get off of buying oils from Saudi Arabia and other places like that. And the Jerusalem artichoke was one of those crops. Unfortunately, a lot of farmers got hoodwinked and swindled into buying a bunch of stuff and trying to grow Jerusalem artichokes for ethanol plants that never ended up being put in there. But as far as like the way I look at Jerusalem artichokes, I'm trying to live off of my farmstead, and I'm trying to be healthy as well. And I feel like the Jerusalem artichokes helps me in both of those areas. So it gives me food self-sufficiency in that I can just stick a tuber somewhere in soil that's not so great, and it can give me a yield without me having to do anything, right? It's really easy, really nice, easy crop. So we eat the roots, of course. The flower petals are one of my favorite things. I've even made a pesto from the flower petals, and the unopened flower buds are nice when they're cooked as well, and cook them until they're just soft. So lots of edible pieces. We've also fed this to our livestock on the farm, and they love to eat it. Although I don't really get a root harvest when I do that. So some ID characteristics: big, hairy leaves, right? The petiole, that little stalk that connects the leaf to the main stem, is a few, like 2.5 inches long, which usually on some flowers, it's a bit shorter. On the flowers themselves, those bracts, which are the green leafy sort of little leaves that are underneath the flower, those have a particular shape to them that when you look at other sunflowers, they have more of a, they taper much more quickly, and these taper very slow to a triangle. So when you dig them up and see the roots, that's the proof right there. And you see those big knobby roots. Other sunflowers don't have that. Now, I didn't even talk about this. This is in the same genus as our annual sunflowers that we get sunflower seeds and sunflower oil from. So there has been some hybridization between the two species. There in, I think it was Switzerland, someone has created a hybrid between the Jerusalem artichoke and the annual sunflower, that they were actually taking the stems and getting a sweet liquid from the stems in the same way that you get sorghum. So a lot of interesting stuff happening, and overseas especially. You know, people took a lot of American plants after the New World was discovered and tried to do breeding and grow them in their region and all over Europe and Asia. So those plants are out everywhere. So the bees really love the sunflowers. There are specialist bees that are just all about sunflowers, in the same way that there are specialist bees that are just about some types of cucurbits, squashes. So this top right, that's one of them, and the top left is another one. There are also several butterflies who eat the leaves, or at least their larvae do, including these painted ladies in the Gorgon checker spot. So because these are native plants and they produce a huge amount of biomass, they have these leaf-eating predators, right? But they also produce a lot of pollen and nectar, so they have their own specialist pollinators as well, which I think is pretty cool. So the seeds of the Jerusalem artichoke are eaten by several different types of birds, and this beautiful ground squirrel. We've also noticed in the past the beavers using them to make their dams. They love to do that, and the muskrats as well. So the difference, I want to show this picture on the bottom right, the difference between the muskrat and the beaver. which when I was a kid, I'd always see muskrats and think they were beavers, but they got that little rat tail, right? All right, here's another root. This is another one that'll feed you. Both of these are perennials. The Jerusalem artichoke is a perennial, so it'll live for several years. It'll make an increasingly larger clump as years go on. And the groundnut is the same way. This is a plant of wetlands. It's a vining plant. They grow in part shade. I've gathered them in the woods or on the edge of the woods. And they're a legume. They actually fix nitrogen. So it's a crop like peas and beans that are actually, they can feed that nitrogen back into the soil. This crop was bred in Louisiana for large tuber size. You can see that top right picture. That's from one of the cultivars that came out of our garden. It's called Treasure. And that was bred in Louisiana State University by a gentleman that I can't remember what his name is now. But he passed away in the late 90s, and he passed all of that germplasm onto a gentleman named Steve Cannon, who's at Iowa State University. So if you email him, Steve Cannon at Iowa State University, he will actually send you some of this improved cultivars, which after 2-3 years, you will have roots that are the size of potatoes. So they do have to stay in the ground for several years, but they're much larger than the wild strains. We grow several wild strains in several of these cultivars, and the cultivars out yield them pretty easily. When you dig them up, the wild ones at least are like walnuts on a string. And that sort of makes digging them up easy to a certain degree. If you can just follow those strings, you can pull up all the roots. If you're going to grow them in the garden, and I think you should, you can literally, when you dig these up through the winter, that's the other thing I didn't even mention about Jerusalem artichoke, is we're digging those up from like November through all the way until they start sprouting in April. And the same is true of the groundnut. So the nice thing about these perennial plants is that you can sort of leave your food on the hoof in the same way that a farmer can have a cattle out there that he can slaughter whenever he feels like it. So we can go out when the ground is not frozen, which does happen for some periods through the winter. We can dig these roots up, put them in the crisper in the refrigerator, and just use them at our leisure over the next month while they sit there. There are several populations of this plant. In the South, there is more of a triploid version, and that a triploid refers to the amount of genes that it has in its genome. There's a diploid version that grows in the North. And the one that grows in the North is much less likely to produce seeds. This is a plant that has been vegetatively propagated. That is to say, a little piece of the root has broken away out of the ground and floated away down the stream and lodged itself to a new place and started growing, or an animal has dug it up and brought it to a new place and it started growing. And that's how it's been growing for so long that they lose the ability to flower and make really good seed because they need another genetically distinct individual nearby in order to make good seed. So this is one, whenever I see seed production, I try to gather seeds. There's a place called Punderson State Park here in Northeast Ohio that's maybe 20 or 30 miles away from here. And that's they have a boardwalk that goes out into their shallow lake, and it's very wet in through there, and there's lots of groundnut and lots of seed production too, because I think it's a wild population that has some genetic diversity. So yeah, cool plant. Oh, by the way, this plant, because it's a legume, it's very high in protein. So it has 3 times the amount of protein that a potato has. So it's usually in the 12 to 15% protein, which is really good for, especially as you're getting older, for that lean muscle mass. So some faunal associations here. Of course, some bees, this little hollow tube nester. that do a lot of those early pollination in the spring when the temperatures are still cold. But I wanted to draw your attention because the flowers don't bring in a lot of insects. That may be part of why there isn't a lot of seed production as well. But there are these what are called extrafloral nectaries. So if you see the picture on the right there, there's a green stalk coming in from the top to a horizontal stalk that goes across the picture. At the very base of that, there are two little horns. And those actually produce nectar. So ants and yellow jackets and other types of insects will actually get nectar from the plant at that spot. And they're actually more to bring those insects there to protect the plant from predators or things that want to eat it. So lots of plants have these little extrafloral nectaries. I see them a lot on the prunus, like peaches and plums and cherries have this at the base of their leaves. You see them a lot on there. That's the only plant I can think of at the moment other than the groundnut. But it's a thing. And they're not as showy as flowers because they're not attracting, it's not about pollination. It's about attracting predatory insects to protect the plant. So some runner-ups. The two of these are wetland plants. The one on the top left is the Sagittaria or the duck potato or the wapato. This is another root crop that was used heavily by native peoples. Really important. It was usually cooked in a pit for several days and then eaten. And this is another one that's a perennial. It's a colony forming plant, so it'll make a big colony over time. Yeah, the root isn't that big. It's maybe $50 in size, but there's a lot of them produced. So yeah, the middle plant there is the cattail. If you want to be able to identify our native cattails from our non-native cattails, you can see the flower at the very top is the male flower, and it's sitting on top of that female flower. The female flower actually is the part where all the fluff comes out in the late fall. So there shouldn't be any space between the two. In our native cattail, there's no space. It also has a wider leaf. So you can see usually the hybrid species and the Asian species and our native species all growing together in the same place, at least on our property. That's how I see them. And the way that I can tell one from the next is the spacing on those flowers. So they should be right on top of each other, just like they are in the ones in this picture here. That being said, the cattail is the supermarket of the swamps. At least that's what Yule Gibbons had a whole chapter on cattail, that's what he named it. There are parts of the cattail that you can eat at almost every part of the year. That male flower that's on top makes pollen that's really tasty. That's used as a flour substitute for pancakes or breads or anything like that. Also, when it is before the pollen is released, you can eat it like a little corn, like a little ear of corn. You could steam those for a few minutes and put a little butter on them, and they're really nice. The roots themselves, in early spring when they're first coming up, there are roots that you can get then. The new emerging roots. In the fall, you will have the roots that are coming out primordially to grow into those ones that you're harvesting in the spring that you can also harvest. So there's a lot of starchy carbohydrate roots that you can harvest throughout the year. A lot of food throughout the year in the cattail. The one on the top right there is the wild hyacinth. This is a sort of forest edge species. It's related to quamash, which is a northwestern herb that was a staple for the peoples of the Pacific Northwest. But this is our eastern counterpart. It's called eastern wild hyacinth, Camassia scyloides. There is a poisonous lookalike called the death camas that has white flowers, but I have yet to see it. I haven't seen it yet. This is another one that is perennial, makes colonies. You can dig them all up, and then they get cooked usually for 24 hours in a pit, and then before the whole thing is consumed. So that's all the roots. I'm trying to cruise through here. I have 3 more. Hopefully I can get through them. So these are the woody shrubs. These are some of my favorites. They're very near and dear to my heart. as all these plants are, in case you couldn't tell. Yeah. So the American hazelnut, we have our own native hazelnut, and it's just as good as a European hazelnut. It's just as tasty. Maybe it hasn't had quite as much breeding. The nuts aren't quite as large, but if you have a nutcracker and you're used to cracking nuts, you could set those things to a little bit smaller. Doesn't really matter. It's a multi-stem shrub. It's in the birch family. So you see these little catkins. Yes, top left there, those catkins are a key identification characteristic. You also see those in birches and alders and other birch family plants. The fruit bracts there, bottom left, they actually wrap around the fruit and they make that little, it's like a little hat over the fruit. And actually Corylus, is the Greek word for hat. So that's what they sort of mean by that. It covers the nut. When the nut is ripened, that green bract opens up and the nut actually can come out very easily. So you can see there on the right, it's a multi-stem shrub. The thing about the hazelnut, this is a fatty nut. This is a nut that is native. It can grow in soils that are sort of not the best soils. It can't necessarily grow in the wetland and down in the muck, but it can grow in most agricultural soils. So this is one of a group of plants that have been proposed as sort of to change agriculture in a way that's more holistic and sustainable. This is an oil producing nut. We grow, right now, the United States, we grow lots of soybeans for their oil, right? That's like McDonald's French fries are fried in soybean oil. So start look at some of our native crops that can provide all of these ecological benefits, as well as producing those that we need for commerce and to keep the wheels greased and the things moving. And the way that we do that isn't tearing out all the soybeans and putting in all the hazelnuts right away. It's a transitioning process that may take years and years, but we need to start that process. Because these perennial plants, the hazelnuts, after you plant them, they get bigger and produce more hazelnuts every year. The soybean doesn't do that. The soybean needs a ton of our energy and manipulation of the soil and processing to get it to where we can use it. So these native plants can take that space. Wild turkeys love hazelnuts. So do the blue jays. They will try to get them out of the plants before you do. So as soon as those bracts start to turn brown, before they open up entirely, you want to get out there and harvest your hazelnuts. Another quick note on the hazelnuts. To start them from seeds, and this is true of a lot of different seeds, we need to take that seed, put it in some moist soil, stick it in a plastic baggie and put the date on it, what it is, and put it in the fridge and leave it there for 60, 90, 120 days. And they will sprout either in the bag or they'll sprout as soon as you take them out of the bag and put them in a warm place. So this is the service berry. It's called the service berry because it blooms at the time of year when the ground is starting to become soft enough that we can bury people. Service berry, right? Service. So it's also called the shad blow because it blooms at a time when the shad is spawning in the creeks and rivers. There's a lot of these sort of like little mnemonic keys that people used to know about that were in the names of these plants. The cool thing about this plant is that it produces a really tasty fruit, and they come in not too long after strawberries. And if you all know, strawberries are like that first crop of the season, right? So this is a nice one to have in your landscape so that you can continue that fruit thing going through the summer. You got your strawberries, next you get your June berries, then you got wild currants and blueberries in July, and it just cascades through the fall like that. So yeah. So some key identification characteristics: that calyx is left over, just like on a pear or an apple, which consequently, this is in the same family. This is in the rose family. So it has that leftover calyx in that picture on the top left. That's a key identification characteristic. Also, the fruit does not ripen evenly. You can see that fruit on the bottom left, that's mostly ripe. They can get a little darker than that even before they're ready to go. On the downy service berry, the winter buds are going to be hairy, like that center picture. And it's going to flower right about the same time as the leaves come out, but it's usually just a little bit before. And those typical rose family flowers with 5 leaves and 10 to 12 stamens and all that. I'm sure you all know all that stuff. I don't need to go through that. So yeah, this is a really cool plant. Lots of birds like to eat the fruit. So you need to put it in a place close to where you're walking all the time. At least you can scare some of them away. I believe that the cedar waxwings came into our orchard because of these trees that were planted. As soon as I planted the Juneberries and they started flowering, the cedar waxwings came and they were there. And they haven't left ever since. And they eat a lot of insect pests in our orchard as well. So I'm really grateful to have them. Yeah. Bur oak. This is a native oak with absolutely massive acorns. So you should be into acorns as food. This might be another one that like your eyes are rolling all the way back into your head as you're hearing me talk about eating acorns. But acorns are eaten all over the world. They're a staple crop in all the United States, from the West Coast to the East Coast to the middle. They're a plant that was eaten in the Mediterranean. They're a plant that was eaten in Spain. Actually, the pork that you can pay the most amount of money for in the world comes from pigs that eat acorns. And consequently, the people there also make breads from acorns and all sorts of other things. It's a staple crop in Turkey. It's a staple crop throughout Asia, and also in Korea specifically, they have a lot of different dishes using the acorn. Now, there are varieties of there's a lot of different oaks. So mainly what we're looking for eating acorns are the oaks that are in the white oak group. And these are oaks that have on their leaves, they're rounded and they don't have bristles at the tips. So the swamp white oak and the bur oak and the white oak and the chestnut oak, and there's several other ones that are in that white oak group. And those produce acorns that have low tannins in them. The tannins are that astringent thing that's in the acorns that when you bite into them, when they're raw, they will suck all the juices out of your mouth and make you wish you hadn't taken a bite out of them. So we want to soak the acorns in water, in several changes of water. It might take up to a week to do that. But when you taste the ground up acorn meal that you've put in water, that you've been changing the water, and you taste that acorn meal after a week, sometimes it takes a bit longer, and it tastes not astringent or not tannic, then it's ready to go. So then you can use it as a base carbohydrate like you would use rice, although it needs a little bit of oil and seasoning to make it taste acceptable, because it doesn't have much of a taste at that point. So yeah, and then it's used in baking bread and in making sort of hominy and different types of porridge. But it's a staple carbohydrate crop. You can think of it like potatoes or rice or all that stuff. So some key identification characteristics. The twigs themselves have this fluted bark, and that's a really easy thing to see. The cap goes almost all the way down the whole acorn, 50 to 75%. It's very ruffled around the edges. And then the leaves have these deep, deep lobes. And at the tips of those lobes, on the red oak group, there will be little bristles. There'll be a tiny little like pin bristle. But on the white oak group, those are not there. So that's what we're looking for, the white oaks. So there's a bunch of things that like to eat the oak leaves. There are insects that are specific to oak flowers and oak leaves. The nuts themselves are an important food to a litany of different types of wildlife, squirrels and birds, wood ducks and screech owls. So there's it's like an ecological powerhouse, the oak trees are. So if we can start moving our agriculture, maybe if 2.5 to 5%, into oaks, we can start providing habitat for wildlife as well as providing things that we need, right? And if we use the cultures from around the world that are already using the oak in a really radical way, whether they're turning it into pork or they're turning it into a value-added product, we can learn from those folks, and we can start to change things for the better, right? So here's some runner-ups. The top left there is the hickory, of course, another oily nut, very closely related to pecans, the same exact genus, just a different species. The top right is the black walnut, another oil-rich nut that is super expensive. There are operations in the Midwest that buy black walnuts. They don't pay very much, but Hammond's is a really good example of that. The bottom left picture is the pawpaw, America's largest fruit, that edible fruit. Super tasty, mango, custard, banana, wonderful fruit, sort of shade tolerant plant. Fruit's better in the full sun, of course, but can take some shade. So it's cool to have a fruiting plant that can take shade. That middle bottom picture is the spice bush. That's another one that we eat the berries sometimes, but mostly we use it as a spice. It has that pumpkin pie, allspice type of flavor, really nice. The bottom right picture is the black haw viburnum, which viburnum with nice fruit. Many of them are not very nice. This one's really, really good, really, really good. And has a huge native range as well. All right, so but finally I got through them. These are the references that I wanted to give y'all. Illinois Wildflowers, Dr. John Hilty has put a bunch of awesome stuff there. He works with the University of Illinois Urbana. There's a bunch of excellent information. The University of Virginia Dendrology Lab has a bunch of excellent information if you want to learn more about identifying these plants. The USDA plant database has a lot of ecology information. Sam Thayer is like the #1 author if you're into wild foods and you want to learn more about that. And he has a lot of identification keys in there to help you do that. So yes, made it all the way through. Sorry, I went over a little bit, Andrew. That was fun.
Hey, no worries. I don't think anyone mind at all. That was fantastic. Thank you, John. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
It's awesome. We're a pollinator focused program here, but it was awesome to see how a lot of those plants that you mentioned have pollinators or ants that help move their seeds and stuff. And oftentimes we don't think how we can benefit from some of these pollinators that we talk about as far as getting food from them. So it was neat to see some that we could harvest for food and could benefit some of the pollinators. There's a ton of people saying thank you and telling you it was a great presentation in the chat box. So make sure to check that out, John. And then it looks like we do have some questions in the Q&A box. If you do have a question, please put in the Q&A box. Don't put in the chat box. But I don't know if you can see that, John. Maybe we'll have you stop sharing your screen. I can do that for you. And then let me know if you can find the Q&A box.
Yeah. So I see several questions about Solomon seal. So Solomon seal is an edible plant. And the variegated variety is used the same way. You want to eat those new shoots in the spring when they're first coming up, before the leaves open up and release from the main stalk, when they're still closed up tightly. That's when you want to be eating the Solomon seal. So but it's a common plant that you see in landscaping. But yeah, it's a native plant and yeah, totally edible.
Nice.
Yep.
See if there's any other ones that you might want to answer.
So there's a question about other ferns being edible. I don't know of any other ferns that are edible. For Anna Kozlenko there, yeah.
Awesome.
So the U-shaped groove, does the U-shaped groove on ostrich fern appear only on the immature stems? As far as I know, it's there all the way on the mature stems. I see it on mature stems all the time. It's one of the things that it's one of the key characteristics that I'm looking for, because there are several other ferns out there that looks sort of like ostrich fern. In our woods, it's the cinnamon fern, which I'm trying to stay away from. But that papery husk that the new shoots are enclosed in, and that U-shaped groove is a pretty key characteristic for me finding it.
Nice. Neil asked, what does the groundnut taste like, and is it treated as a potato in a culinary sense? I thought that was an interesting question.
Yes, I didn't mention that. So the groundnut tastes sort of like a bean. I make hummus out of it, and I use it in place of the garbanzo beans. We also make soups and chilies from it and use it the same way as you would a bean. It's starchy, but it when you cook it, it tastes like a cooked bean. So anything that you cook beans in, you can use the groundnut. I also, it makes great chips too. If you put it on a mandolin and slice it thin, wow, and put those and fry those, it makes really wonderful crispy chips.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one that kind of caught my eye, that groundnut. I think that would be a great crop to rotate in the garden. That'd be great. Yeah.
Yes. It's cultivated in Japan. It's called hadaimo.
Yeah. Wow. Let's see. All right. Well, we did go a little over time, so maybe John, go through those last couple of questions and pick one you like, and we'll do one final question before we end tonight's webinar.
Yeah, I think we're probably good.
Okay, cool. All right, everyone. Well, thanks again, John. And I don't know how much, I can't remember how much you mentioned at the beginning, but maybe do another shout out for Red Beet Row.
Yes. So our website is www.redbeetrow.com. And it has on there, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for. If you have any fruit tree pruning, or you have edible landscaping or permaculture design that you're interested in having done, we do that kind of work. And we also have the nursery that you can pre-order plants right now from our nursery, including a lot of native plants and sort of interesting plants that have these edible uses or medicinal uses. A lot of natives in there as well. So that's redbeetrow.com.
And I'll make sure to include a link to that on our website. Again, our website where you can watch this recording and any of the past recordings from this year and the last 4 years. It's go.osu.edu/NEOPS. So go and check that out. Go and check out and support John Wright and Red Beet Row. We really appreciate them being on and being a great finale for another successful year for the winter series. And I just looked at the weather report. There's a chance we might get 6 to 8 inches here on Friday. I know people around the country might be getting more or less snow. Maybe if you're in California, you're getting more snow right now. But anyway, no matter where you're at, check out the website and sign up for the summer festival. We'll make sure to send you more information to your inbox and update it on the website when it becomes available. It's BEET. Yeah.
BEET, yes.
Yep. And yeah, all right. Well, we'll end it there. Thank you all that were here, sticking it out, listening to all the questions, and thanks again, John.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right, we'll see you all at the summer festival.